Welcome back, darlings, to the podcast Life Looks Different Now. I'm your host, Slandy Noel. In this podcast, we focus on reading one chapter from the Bible every week, doing our best to decipher the Word of God, learning its rules, its laws, its principles, and apply them to our daily lives. Last week, we read from Genesis chapter 40. And from reading Genesis chapter 40, we learned that Joseph was still in prison for a crime that he did not commit. However, Joseph had a good position, a leadership position, even in the prison. And there, Joseph had the opportunity to meet two prominent figures. He met the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, as well as the Pharaoh's chief baker. Now, both of these men had dreams, and we know that the ancient Egyptians valued dream. They interpret dreams, and dreams are very important to them. When they get visions, very important matter. But these individuals couldn't interpret their own dreams, so they were troubled. There we learned that Joseph interpreted their dreams, and everything came to pass just as Joseph had interpreted the dreams. And we learned that the chief cupbearer eventually got released from the prison and was restored in his position. However, he had forgotten about what Joseph had done for him. Now, this week, we are reading from Genesis chapter 41. Let's see what lesson lies in Genesis chapter 41. So stay tuned. Now, before I go ahead to reading the chapter, I have a favor to ask you. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. As you and I are learning the Word of God, we are reading together. Others want to do the same, so please give them the opportunity to do that alongside us. Share the channel, like the channel, and of course, subscribe to this channel. Thank you in advance for your support. Now, let's get on to reading Genesis chapter 41. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, even other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, and there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offense today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief bakers in the custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us. He's a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, So it came about. I restored to my office, and the cup baker and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all of the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as the beginning. Then I woke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is, as I told you, Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, there will arise 7 years of famine. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. Joseph rises to power. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you have commanded. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphinath Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all of my hardship in all my father's house." The name of the second son he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come in. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread all over the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. This story is fantastic. I am just elated. It is an amazing story. It's a story of rags to riches. I mean, we see Joseph being enslaved for years. This young man was sold into slavery by his own brothers. His father believed him to be dead, yet he had been living in a prison for many, many years. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. And today we are meeting Joseph when Joseph is about 30 years old. We learned that Joseph had been in the prison for another 2 years after he interpreted the dream for the cupbearer, the chief cupbearer of Pharaoh, and the chief baker of Pharaoh. 2 more years. Even though Joseph had asked for the chief cupbearer not to forget him, we learned here that the chief cupbearer did indeed forget what Joseph had done. Or maybe he didn't forget. Maybe he was waiting for an opportunity to share to Pharaoh about this young Hebrew man that he met in the pit. We learned that Pharaoh had a dream. In fact, Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And they were troubling, prophetic dreams. Yet Pharaoh couldn't understand them. In the first dream, Pharaoh saw 7 beautiful, healthy, plump cows that came out of the Nile River to feed on the grass. And then following those 7 beautiful, plump, and healthy cows were 7 famished, thin, ugly cows. They were emaciated, and they came up after the healthy ones and they devoured them. And then we learned that Pharaoh was troubled by this dream. He woke up, yet he went back to sleep and had a second dream. And in the second dream, Pharaoh saw there were 7 good ears of grain. They were healthy, they are plump, and he saw them growing in a single stalk. And right there, he saw 7 thin, wasted ears of grain growing up right after them. And somehow, those famished looking, those wasted looking ear of grains ate the healthy ones. And here's the thing, because we know, ancient Egyptians they place a great emphasis on dreams. They understood vision. The Pharaoh became very troubled. He understood that there's something going on here and he couldn't understand what was happening. He was shaken by these 2 visions. He woke up the next day. He called all the wise men in his kingdom. He called the magicians and he asked for them to interpret these dreams. Then we learned that these men couldn't interpret the dreams, and they're supposed to be the priests, the shamans of this land. And none of them could interpret the dream. But what I did find fascinating about reading this chapter is how these magicians, these men, these wise men, they didn't try to interpret the dream. They didn't even attempt it because they understood that they didn't have that power. And they didn't try to lie to Pharaoh. They simply said, listen, we don't know what these 2 visions mean. They were honest. Maybe they're afraid they could have lost their head if they end up interpreted these dreams incorrectly. We don't know. But we all know that these men couldn't do the job. And I'm surprised that the Pharaoh didn't get angry and put them in prison even. I don't know. But I'm amazed by that because, the Pharaoh had all the power in the land. He could have done anything he wanted with these men, but he didn't. He actually accepted the fact that they couldn't interpret these dreams. And there we see the cupbearer, the chief cupbearer, enters the scene. There, the chief cupbearer saw the opportunity to mention to Pharaoh that he met a young Hebrew man who was able to interpret his dream as well as the chief baker's dream when they were in prison together. He told the Pharaoh, this young Hebrew was in the service of the captain of the guard. And he was the only one there who was able to interpret their dreams. And their dreams came about exactly like this young Hebrew man told him that it was going to happen. And we learned that the Pharaoh did not hesitate. He then called for Joseph. Then Joseph got cleaned. Joseph got dressed properly. They put him in fine clothing so he can be acceptable, so he can be presented acceptably to the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh summoned for Joseph. Joseph quickly got released. He went to the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh said to Joseph, I heard that you can interpret dreams. Joseph quickly corrected the Pharaoh. Now that's bold. Now imagine being a slave and trying to correct your master. Not only was the Pharaoh a master, the Pharaoh was the king of the whole nation of Egypt. He could have gotten Joseph killed. for this for his statement, but he didn't. Joseph corrected him and said, "Nah, Pharaoh, it's not me, brother. I'm not the one who can interpret dreams." Joseph insisted that only God has the power to interpret dreams, because God is the all-knowing. And then he promised to Pharaoh that he'll pass along the interpretation of these dreams upon hearing them. Then the Pharaoh proceeded to recount what he saw in these dreams. Again, he said he saw 7 healthy cows were eaten by 7 scrawny, horribly looking cows. Such ugly cows that he has never seen in the land of Egypt. And there they come, they ate all, the healthy cows, yet they were still not satisfied. They were still ugly. They were still famished. They were still, starved-like looking, even after eating these healthy cows. And then he explained then he shared the second dream with Joseph, where he said in the second set of dream, he saw 7 ear of grain swallowed up by 7 scrawny looking grain. And Joseph listened attentively. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, "These 2 dreams are exactly the same." He revealed to Pharaoh, he said to Pharaoh, this is what God is revealing is about to happen in the land of Egypt. It's not going to change. It is about to happen. And Egypt needs to prepare for it. And God allows the Pharaoh to have 2 dreams to emphasis on the fact that this thing will take place. There will be 7, Joseph said there will be 7 years of great abundance. See, God put great emphasis on the fact that this is going to happen. 7 years of great abundance, represented by the 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy, grains, which will then be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. And those 7 years are represented by the 7 sickly looking cows, the 7, famished looking grains. And those 7 years will quickly follow the wonderful 7 years of abundance. Listen, if you've never lived in a land that has been famished, you can never understand how horrific and terrifying that is. For those of us who have lived or are living in impoverished countries, we have a greater understanding what was happening there. When I lived in Haiti as a kid, there were years when the U.S. placed an embargo on the land. An embargo is when there's no business is being done and there's no import or export on that country, and the people suffer. And I remembered when there are certain grains, there are certain that we just couldn't buy. And there were people who had the money. Even for us, we weren't poor. Even when we had the funds, when you buying a small container of rice for $200-300, we're not talking a big bag of rice here, or a small bag of beans for 100, and it's insane. And where a great amount of people are dying, they just cannot afford it. They can't eat. They're malnourished. And that is what was happening. That this is what Joseph was letting Pharaoh know was going to happen in Egypt. And what Joseph did next was extremely unusual. After interpreted the Pharaoh's dream, Joseph, who being a slave, I mean, spent years of his life as a slave, almost half of his life as a slave in the Egyptian land. He went ahead to advise the Pharaoh. I mean, if you're thinking about it, everyone walked an eggshell around the Pharaoh. I mean, we all know people who are president or kings, wherever people see someone who has a lot of power and a lot of wealth, people become very anxious and nervous, can't even speak to them, as if they're not human beings, as if they don't put their pants on just like everybody else, So I will imagine that Joseph must have had some level of fear, but we see that he didn't. While everybody else was walking an eggshell around the Pharaoh, he didn't. He simply decided, you know what, I am going to advise the Pharaoh on what needs to be done here for the safety and the protection of this land. He then went on to say to the Pharaoh that it's very important, it will be wise to hire or to appoint, he proposed that the Pharaoh appoint one man to manage this upcoming crisis. He advised the Pharaoh to appoint that one man, one leader, along with a team of overseers to help him take over, to take over this project where 20% of the crop of the land for the next 7 years should be taken from the people and put in storehouses. Now, this is where we start seeing taxes. This is where the whole idea of tax came from, just so you know. Where now we are all paying taxes. So he advised that the Pharaoh, appoint this leader, this wise man, alongside with overseers to help him execute this massive project. So then they'll have resources and food to feed the people. They want to make sure that there's provision for the 7 famine years. Surprisingly enough, rather than feeling offended or taking and getting angry at this young man or punishing this young man or imprisoning this young man again, the Pharaoh actually took Joseph's wise proposal into account. The Pharaoh decided that Joseph would be the one appointed to prepare for these upcoming, crises. Now we can't help but to ask, why would the Pharaoh do that? Like, why? This is a young man who has been in prison for over a decade. Like, why did the Pharaoh choose to appoint Joseph? We have to see here that even the Pharaoh could see that God was with Joseph. Right? Everything Joseph touched, it became abundant. It grew. And the Pharaoh could sense that God was with Joseph. Joseph was able to interpret these dreams because God was with him. And the Pharaoh is acknowledging that here. And that is why he decided to appoint Joseph to take over this massive project. He believed that the Spirit of God was within Joseph, was with Joseph. And right there and then, he gave Joseph all this power, this breathtaking power. This Hebrew young man who's literally just been released from prison. Isn't it amazing what God is able to do? It's amazing how some people, when we suffer, we can't see the end. We feel like we're ready to give up. But God is ready to bless us. It doesn't matter where you stand today. It doesn't matter what you have today. It doesn't matter what you are going through today. Know that God will appoint you, will bless you at the right time. God is preparing you for something that you yourself cannot even imagine. It's greater than what you could possibly imagine. Stay in the faith. Stay believing, because that's what Joseph did. Yet, and God elevated this young man from the prison, the pit, to putting him in charge, second in command in the whole land of Egypt. Joseph became the seer of Egypt. It's insane. And Pharaoh continued on he became the vizier of Egypt. And Pharaoh gave him the signet, his own signet, giving it to Joseph, giving him fine clothing, a gold necklace, and then giving him a chariot to go around the whole country of Egypt, a designated chariot, so he can go around and start working on this project. And that is a symbolic of Joseph's authority over the whole land of Egypt. And in addition, the Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian wife. He married him into a prestigious family. How beautiful is that? Honey, when God is ready to bless you, there is no one here on earth who can stop it. You are in for great abundance. Believe that. Then we learn that in a very short period of time, Joseph came from rag to riches, to power and fame, and all of the authority and glory and culture, cloud that came with that. He got all of that so he can go and act on behalf of the Pharaoh. And then we learned that Joseph was 30 years old when it happened. Now imagine he was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. 13 years later, Joseph is finally being recognized. He's finally being lifted up. He's finally giving this leadership position, the highest position, the second highest position in the whole land. And there we learned that Joseph already had a whole plan on how he's going to save the nation of Egypt. God never forsake Joseph. God was there through it all. Through it all. So whatever you are enduring today, know that God is in it with you. He has not forgotten about you. He has not forsaken you. He's in it with you, preparing you, molding you, shaping your personality. So when you come into that power, when you come into that wealth, you don't lose it. So you know what to do with it and how you can bless others. So stay in his presence. Then we learned that for 7 years, there was plenty of wealth, so much abundance, so much grain. And we learned that Joseph oversaw all of that, the gathering of all the grain, 20%. And there's the crop, there's so much abundance. We learned that God is blessing this young man so much. There's so much abundance that Joseph lost count of how much grain that he has taken, like he has acquired from the people for the 7 years. He ensured the surplus was stored in the major cities for the nation. He was even able to store grain, that he couldn't even account it for. That's how much, in many stations that he couldn't even account it for. Demonstrating that God has always been with Joseph, and God was always going to continue on being with Joseph. Everything Joseph touched turned into gold. Everything you're about to touch is going to turn into gold. Furthermore, we learned that God blessed Joseph with two sons. The first he named Manasseh, which implied forgetting, meaning he hadn't forgotten about his difficulties of what he went through. He hasn't forgotten. And all of those things did not outweigh his new blessing. He was blessed with this beautiful son. And then he had a second son, Ephraim, reflecting on how God gave him prosperity, even in the land that he was enslaved. How marvelous is that? Joseph drastically improved the fortune of the Pharaoh, the fortune of Egypt, and Joseph was blessed abundantly with wealth, wife, family. God is good. God is good. And just as Joseph predicted, after the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of abundance, the 7 plump years, the famine struck Egypt. And then the people ran, they couldn't feed themselves anymore. They ran to Pharaoh, asking for food, begging for Pharaoh to take care of them. And Pharaoh said to them, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you to do. And then we learned that Joseph did not just redistributed the grains to the people. No. He used this opportunity to build the Pharaoh's wealth even more. And, the Pharaoh at this point was not only the Pharaoh of the land, he was the wealthiest, the most powerful. He was all in all the lands. Because Joseph had, set up this plan where he knew by selling the grain to the people, to the Egyptians people, and all the nations surrounding them who are in need, since now there's a famine. It was a global famine, that it could build the Pharaoh's wealth. And that's what he did. We can see that Joseph was a businessman. Joseph didn't go to a business school. Joseph was an entrepreneur. He was a businessman. He had leadership skills. He didn't go to a leadership school. So listen, when God has chosen you for a position, chosen you to do something, he'll prepare you for it. Some people are naturally gifted with certain things. Some people are naturally gifted with numbers. I'm not. It amazes me to see how my son is so naturally gifted with numbers. And I admire these folks. So when God put a gift inside of you and people are telling you, oh, you need this qualification, this certificate, and this, that, listen to me. Allow God to use you the way that he wants to use you. Don't let any kind of degree or lack thereof stop you from going out there and doing God's work and improving other people's lives and serving other people. God had appointed Joseph for such a time as this. God used Joseph to save Egypt and all the nations, all the surrounding nations, and all of its peoples. God can use you to change your community, to change your family, to change a whole nation. So don't let the lack of whatever that people are saying you need to have today to do a work to stop you from doing God's work. You go out there and let God use you to do his work. So I hope that you actually had many takeaways from this chapter. I hope you read this chapter alongside me. There are so many beautiful lessons here. So many beautiful lessons to know that if we wait on the Lord, he will redeem us. There's no such thing as forgotten years. Everything you've lost will be restored to you. Believe that. Believe that. And Joseph is teaching us that today. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Don't think because you were not born in a wealthy family, or because you were not born in a two-parent household, or because you were not born and living in certain countries around the world, or because you don't have, certain reputations, or because you don't know certain group of people. Don't worry about none of those things. None of those things can disqualify you for what God was created you to be, for what God put you here to do. You have it in you. Allow God to use you for His glory. Thank you for tuning in this week. I appreciate you. I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. And I'm looking forward to reading Genesis chapter 42 with you next week. Until next time, darlings, bisous.